Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Elkat Global.
And it is my pleasure to have with us today Thomas Knudsen. Thomas is a good friend, great contact. I've known him for many years. He's one of the most interesting people I know, actually, and I don't say that lightly. He wears a lot of different hats, actually. On one side, he is the chairman of Toll Logistics. On another side, he's also a director of Ruma Group, which is a family office. And he's also an advisor to several technology-related as well as capital-related funds across the world. So, Thomas, pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Rado. We've known each other for a long time, and equally, I would say you are one of the most interesting people in our industry. I think you've managed to do something which others haven't in the past, is create a community within supply chain management that connects both logistics providers, manufacturers, producers, and so on. So excited to be here.
Super. So maybe let me briefly tell the audience a little bit about your career. So you've actually, you started from the army for a few years, and then you had a long-standing career with Maersk Group. Yeah, you had several positions all the way to executive positions. You ran different regions for the Maersk Line. You ran as a CEO of Damco, and then a couple of years ago you moved to Toll. You were the global CEO of Toll. Now for the last couple of years you're a chairman of Toll. And then I mentioned some of the other things that you're doing. So I guess what I want to ask you is, what are some inflection points to this very successful career? Many would agree. But when you look back, there's typically 1, 2, 3 points, yeah, that you can pinpoint and say, okay, this was some of my inflections that helped me be where I am. What are those points for you, Thomas?
It's a good question, Rado, and I think the older you get, the more you think about it, because I found out in my career that there's a lot of coincidences that happen. So where many people ask for kind of a well-designed roadmap to get to where you are, rarely that's been my experience that it happens. So let me give you a couple of inflection points, but perhaps also longer-term experiences that have formed where we come from. So perhaps I should start with that. So I left Denmark in 1992. And moved to Egypt, then I moved to Dubai, then Saudi Arabia, US, Trinidad and Tobago, and so on. So what I think my first experience is this idea of cultures and the importance of cultures. So when you live in a specific culture, you generally look at all other cultures and say they're strange. They eat strange food, they do strange things, they're not like us. And I think my first inflection point was realizing that there are no good or bad cultures, that are just different cultures. And if you get passionate about trying to understand what they are and what they do, you'll have never-ending learning around the planet. And actually, you'll be a much better person because you actually appreciate the differences are what makes the world a great place, whether you talk about morally or from a business perspective. So that's probably one, which was not a specific point per se. I think if you talk about like specific times. When I was working for Maersk in Dubai, Maersk at that point, they now have a similar strategy, wanted to create an integrated strategy where they wanted to move from having the shipping line, the terminals, and the logistics as 3 separate parts to integrating that. And at that point, they wanted to create an end-to-end logistics chain or supply chain. And I was part of the commercial team that had to sell that. So when Maersk rolled that out, I became super interested in logistics and supply chains because I realized that while shipping was super interesting as an asset business, you were moving places from one port to another. But for most of our customers, that wasn't really relevant. They weren't looking at the transit time of a ship. They were looking at end-to-end lead times, and logistics captured that. So this was back in 2005 and 6, and that really changed my view of the world in terms of saying, yes, shipping is interesting, but actually the view from the customer is that shipping is just a small part of that. So I wanted to spend time on logistics. So I did an executive master's in supply chain management in Spain. I started spending time outside work trying to understand it. And I worked for Maersk Logistics for a period and really enjoyed kind of the end-to-end supply chain. And then the last one, which is probably more personal inflection point, was that in 2016 and 17, I was offered a couple of opportunities in Maersk that were based in Europe. And they were great opportunities that, I should kill for. But I realized that for me, the future privately and business-wise was in Asia. And so I said no to those roles, which also meant that I had to reflect on what does yes look like. And that was a career that stayed in Singapore, where I'm now a Singapore resident, and I'm also a Singapore citizen. My wife is from Singapore, our family is here. So I had to reflect on what am I willing to do in the rest of my career from a business perspective. And there, Maersk, for all the right reasons, are moving people around, changing strategy and so on. And I wanted to find a company that was Asian, based in Asia, but with a global perspective. And their Toll really fit what I liked. And that's why I joined Toll a little more than 5 years ago, and why I'm still there.
Super, love it. And your sharing on the linear side is quite consistent with a lot of other executives that came on the podcast, with people that shared also on our book. I think that as we grow older, not that I'm, not that both of us are that old, but usually when you're younger, I can talk for myself maybe, we have this idea that it goes linear, that, you do this job and then you grow, you do this job. I think that's hardly ever the case. I remember talking to another CEO, and he was saying that he actively tells his team, like, look, take it easy. Yeah? I mean, don't be so stressed. Don't be so focused on the next promotion. Or, if you do a good enough job, if you focus on on the now, and you do a good job, it will come. You don't need to stress yourself about it. And I think a lot of, especially high achievers, are extremely stressed sometimes and focused. No, I need to be promoted. I need to get to this. I need to do my next gig. But in life, a lot of times things are not linear. They are a bit of a monkey bar.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think there's two elements to that. One is that, when I joined Maersk, the process was really that if you were a talent, you would get into a new role every 2 years. But that often meant that you missed the circularity of the business we're in, right? So you would be in a job for 2 years, and you would either hit it when it was bad or when it was good. And you didn't necessarily learn how to manage through a cycle of good and bad. So you would often make decisions that were the right for that specific cycle, but you wouldn't necessarily learn the entire cycle. So I think time does give you lessons that are hard to get if you don't take the time. And I think the second point is that, it's easy to focus on this. I want to be in success in every job. But if you ask me about my key learnings, they were when I got it wrong, when I failed. And I think you don't build resilience by being successful in your entire career. I'm not saying you should actively seek out failure, but you should certainly embrace failure when it happens, because over the last 3 years, but generally in business, I think one of the key skills of an executive is resilience, right? That you can handle it when it gets tough, that you can keep your energy, that you can motivate the people that work with you, that you can see what comes afterwards. And if you've only had success, or you've had a very linear career, resilience is not an obvious thing to develop. So I think toughness sometimes comes from trying different things and not always being successful and having different views of life.
Absolutely. Now, bringing it a little bit to logistic in particular, yeah. So it's, you mentioned you started in shipping, then I love the story, yeah, with an end-to-end, or with a supply chain view, an end-to-end, the movement of those goods, yeah, from how do they say in food? They say from farm to fork, I guess, is the meaning. How do you see the 3PL industry, Thomas? You, as the chairman of Toll, there's been some fantastic years. Yeah, the last couple of years have been unbelievable for everybody in shipping, logistics, transportation. Now, as you mentioned, maybe those 2 years of roughness will come, or more, I don't know. But how do you see things evolving? And specifically, how do you see the 3PL industry maintaining relevance in a world where shipping lines are crossing into Maersk or CMA, or there's different things that are crossing over? You have the e-commerce and Amazon that are crossing over into 3PL. So there's quite a few gray areas that are emerging.
So it's probably a longer answer, Rado, but I think first of all, I think there is a fundamental difference between what we do in 3PL and what the shipping lines, for that sake, the airlines do, because they are asset owners, and the key driver of profitability in airlines and shipping line is how do you fill your asset. It beats everything else. It's all about the asset and filling the asset. Whereas in logistics, it's about how do we deliver a product that our customer is happy with. There's very low switching costs. We don't have a physical asset we can offer to our customers except for within primarily warehousing and distribution. So especially in forwarding, it's all about, are you giving the customer the right price at the right product at all times? And that drives a very strong customer focus. And I think that makes us very different from the shipping lines. It doesn't mean that the shipping lines are not focused on the customer. It just means that their focus is different, and it's more on how do I get the customer so I have a full ship. And that drives very much a pricing mindset of filling the asset, but through pricing. So that I think is going to be the challenge for the entrants that are trying to bridge both, is how do you get that maniac focus on the customer at the same time as you balance your assets and filling the assets. And I think that is a challenge. So I think I'll leave that to the integrators to focus on how they solve that problem. But I think very much that we are still relevant, because we do a number of things for our customers, right? We ensure that their logistics chain is possible through using a large number of partners, right? So regardless if you're the biggest shipping line in the world, you only have a number of services, and you will have potential problems with your IT system or your equipment or your ships. We can offer that you can use any shipping line in the world or any airline in the world as a principle, and that gives us a lot more flexibility to pick the right solution for the customer, whether it's a price decision or whether it's a service decision. So I think the justification for the 3PLs are clearly there. If you're talking about future and hinting at Amazon and perhaps the disruption, I think if we start by the tech disruptors or the digital freight forwarders or supply chain partners, I absolutely think they're driving the industry in the right direction, because we are an industry that has relied on pieces of paper and stamp and so on. But I think there's also sometimes the lack of understanding of why that is. We move businesses and products from a place that's very complex to a place that's very complex. And the people that we move it with, customs, immigration, shipping lines, and so on, in many ways do rely on paper and stamps and processes. And our value is really navigating that system. And we haven't seen anyone who's been able to translate that into a digital product now. That doesn't mean that they don't have a place. It doesn't mean that we won't get there at some point. But I think why we are relevant today is that we combine the digital solution with a hands-on problem solving. And it's not like we in Toll or our competitors are not digitally enabled, right? We do have technology that backs us up and so on. So I think it's too easy to say that there's digital freight forwarders and non-digital freight forwarders. But I do think that what the digital freight forwarders are doing is pushing the classical, traditional, historical freight forwarders to move in the right direction in terms of getting better engagement with customers through technology. And then you got Amazon, and let's throw Alibaba in there, because I think those are the two, 500 or 1,000-pound gorillas out there that are trying to integrate supply chains with their platforms. I absolutely think that that's a competition, but there are also a lot of customers who are not comfortable with that, right? They see this as, handing over their business to somebody who will then control it from farm to fork. And for some people, that's not an attractive proposition. They want to be sure that they have access to data, that nobody else controls their data, and they have visibility through how their products flow from farm to fork. And I think the 3PLs still have very much a relevance. So I think the Amazons and the Alibabas and other platforms will probably have a bigger pie and a bigger share of that pie. But I still think that there's plenty of space for independent 3PLs like Toll and our competitors to operate.
2 weeks ago, there was the Munich Logistics Fair, and a couple of weeks ago, anyway. And then there were a lot of discussions. I think this whole trend of consolidation, mergers and acquisition will continue within 3PLs. And actually, there were quite a few of the executives, and it's a clear trend that emerges that big is not necessarily better, that companies like Toll, like other mid-size, maybe mid-size is not the right term because you guys are multi-billion, but it's not, it's not the huge ones, it's not the DHLs of the world. You can offer a lot more customized services and a lot more personal, and a lot of the clients would still prefer that. So I think there's definitely a place for that. Now, I want to throw this wild idea that I also heard, maybe not so wild, that I heard that at the fair, CargoWise, and then WiseTech as a company is a system wildly adopted or fairly well adopted within the 3PL industry. And I think if we look at the top 30, top whatever, most of them are using CargoWise. I think there's only a very few that have not implemented it as a solution. So somebody said at some point, what if Richard White is the CEO of CargoWise? What if Richard decides that, how about I become a 4PL, and which they kind of could be, and then he switches that system and all the data that he has to all of a sudden integrate and have access to all the different rates, and then he starts to play the master of the master of the system. So asking you the hard question, how likely or unlikely do you see this happening, and what's your thoughts?
I think that's highly unlikely for a number of reasons. Number one, in order to be a 4PL, you need to have 3PLs, 2PLs to execute on your behalf. So if you went in and took or the large majority of 3PLs and 2PLs and created a competing product, I don't think you'd be very popular with those as a starting point. I think number two would be that if you look at CargoWise and Richard, I think they've been very successful with what they've done so far. So why would you do that when your existing model works really, really well and you have the opportunity to actually expand your market offering through going deeper into other segments, but really serving your customers? So those are a couple of arguments. I have several more why I don't think that works. I actually don't think that anyone has been able to demonstrate that the 4PL is very profitable as a model. I think it can be part of a 3PL model or a 3PL offering like Toll and others, but I don't think by itself that it's wildly successful. But I think the question to ask is probably that if the entire industry or a big part of it is relying on a single platform as its underlying operational system, that creates risk for all of us. And that I think is an interesting question, saying when DSV, DHL, Toll, Siva, and others are using the same operational system, what if? And that I think is a conversation that will probably start coming in the years to come, to say we're very much reliant on a single platform to run our day-to-day business. It's not different than SAP or Oracle in the ERP space, but it is certainly the core system in most freight forwarders.
And I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that on that angle, because I'm not aware of another operating system that works as well or even existing.
I agree. There's a reason why CargoWise is very successful. There are other alternatives, but I think our conclusion has been that CargoWise fits our purpose very well.
Mm. Now, a question that comes a lot, especially when talking about the role of the board, the role of the non-executive board. I mean, now you're chairman, and the role of the CEO in companies. I mean, it may be obvious for some, but you've lived through that transition. Yeah, you were the MD, the CEO of Toll, and now you're the chairman of Toll. So tell us a little bit, what were the main differences? What are the main differences in between these two hats, two roles?
Yeah, first of all, if you ask most academics and many practitioners, they would say that the best solution is not to promote a CEO to become the chairman, because they are very different roles, and it can be easy for the chairman to misunderstand his or her role, or chairperson his or her role in the future, because they are quite different. Admittedly, there's also a difference between being an executive chair and a non-executive chair. So an executive chair is, of course, spending a lot of time in the business together with the CEO in actually running the business. So that's different. But if you take the difference between the CEO and the non-executive chair, I think it's important to realize that there are some specific roles that the board and the chair has, which is around governance. So what's the governance of the business? Not in the narrow sense, but in the broader sense of, are we running a business that's fit for purpose for the long term? And then all the governance around that. There is something about the succession of the CEO and the leadership team. There's something about representing the shareholders towards and together with management, but there's also representing the view of the CEO and the business towards the owners of the business and so on. So there's some distinctly different roles that a board and a chairman has. It's actually quite a difficult balance to find, especially if you are the CEO or have been the CEO. So I can share my personal challenges, of course, that I can often see that there is something going on in the business where I think I understand it, where I may or may not agree with what the CEO has chosen to do. As a traditional chairman, you might not have that understanding because you haven't been deep involved. So you really have to be clear as a non-exec chairman with a past as CEO on, hey, I've got to stay out of this because it's actually not my role. This is what the CEO does, and the CEO has a better view of how the business is performing at that time. So the CEO must make that call. Clearly, if you have a lot of disagreement, then as a CEO and chairman, you have to sit down and say, hey, I'm seeing these things. Why are we doing that? And so on. But it's important for the chairman to give enough space for the CEO and the leadership team to run their business. I think the value that the chairman can do is, of course, to ask good questions. It is to ensure that there is a good process in the board, so that the board is has equal voices, so you don't have a specific part of the board that has a stronger or weaker voice, that you have people on the board who have different views, different experiences, so they can challenge and ask good questions. So a lot of some people think that the chairman is supposed to have a lot of ideas, and he's going to drive or she's going to drive the business. But I actually think that the role of the chairman is to create a great board and then ensure that the voices in the board are heard equally, and then you get to the best outcome of those. So process is actually quite important for a chairman.
And so you mentioned you mentioned this, don't get involved as a main challenge, as a chairperson versus actually being the CEO. I'll probe a little bit further. Any other common misconceptions that you've come across, regarding specifically the role of the board? I hear quite a bit all the time, so I'm just curious if, in your opinion, you come across one or two that stand out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who thinks that the board or a board role is something where you meet every quarter and then you listen to a presentation, then you ask some questions, and then you get paid a nice board fee, and that's it. But I think there's much more to being on a board than that. I think there's something about staying relevant. So if you have to be relevant on a board, and back to my comments about how do you add value to the shareholders and to the CEO, is by having informed opinions or questions that adds value to the business, where the CEO says, wow, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't seen that this technology is happening. So AI is a good example of having something happening, where having somebody who understands that can challenge the business. So I think as a board, it needs to be a well-informed board. It has to be a diverse board. And diverse can mean gender, but it can also mean experiences, background, geography, industries, and so on. But it's really important that the board can provide inspiration to the CEO and challenge. And that means that the board role is not just about showing up for a quarterly meeting, it means being engaged. And I think the other one is the board can be a good sparring partner for the CEO. So, we have a number of different people on our board with different backgrounds. And at least when I was CEO, and I think it's the same thing with Alan today, it's great to call up somebody who has been the former CEO of KPMG and says, hey, what do you think is happening within the area of so-and-so? Or what are you learning through the other boards you are involved in regarding digitalization? And often freight forwarding doesn't get inspired by other freight forwarding digitalization journeys. But if you have a chairman or a board member who is in a digital business, you might actually get inspired for what they're doing with consumers in banking, or what they're doing in telecom or whatever. So I think having a diverse board with different views to inspire the CEO is quite important.
And I love how you said that the people think that boards meet every quarter, get a hefty sum of money, and it's some sort of badge of honor. I think it's a very common perception, to be honest. I do come across in our search business, a lot of executives say, okay, now I've been whatever CEO or COO, or I've reached the pinnacle, whatever that pinnacle is. So now I think I should go on some boards because it's a good retirement. I'm like, well, I mean, in some ways, yes, you're not actively running a business, but in other ways, hey, you don't just sit there and I mean, you got to maintain relevance, as you said. It's not a passive, yeah.
And I think if you look at it, it's actually the same thing for the CEO. If you look at what was the role of the board or the CEO 25 years ago, it was to make money. And ideally, you wouldn't, get in trouble and get thrown in jail for making that money. But that was really, to a simplified way, the role of the CEO and the chairman. If you look at what has happened over the last 25 years in terms of just financial crisis, financial scandals, the responsibility as a board towards the wider shareholder and stakeholder environment has increased, right? Now we're talking about climate change, sustainability, diversity and inclusion, safety. As a CEO, as a chairman, you really have to be on top of a lot of things and really be well informed, because you are accountable and responsible. And the chain of responsibility for boards is getting further and further out, and that means you actually have to spend more and more time being involved. So no, it's not just getting the fat fees. And I think CEOs who want to make a transition have to really think about why they're doing it, because just collecting a check and sitting and asking questions, there's much more to board work. But I think that CEOs and former executives can be great board members, but they have to be clear on what their value is. It's not the fact that they were a CEO, it's specific skills and competencies or views or backgrounds that they bring to it. But it's not just the title.
Now, on the topic of technology, because you're involved with a couple, and I know you're an advisor. Plus, you're curious by nature, and you're very close to so many developments. Log tech, in particular, supply chain tech, has seen a boom. Probably the golden years. I've not been around as much as you have, but the last 2 years has seen some incredible sums of money being pushed into it. And now, of course, again, we are in the winter of that. There's been a lot of also hype and people that raise money off PowerPoints and not really fixing an underlying problem or throwing a shiny object in there. I guess my question is, where do you see the biggest low-hanging practical fruits? I think when we talk about technology, it's easy to get lost in the shiny blockchain, changing, even AI now, yeah? But ultimately, what is that thing that we have a problem with, whether it is, just in shipping, you have pieces of paper, put it on digital. Yeah, this is a very silly example, but what are some of the really low-hanging fruits that you think within logistics technology can fix and should fix in the next 2 years and startups should focus on?
Yeah, so I think crisis is good because, as you said, there's been a lot of hype, and I think there's been a lot of funding going into a lot of companies that shouldn't get funding. So ultimately, I think that it kind of creates focus on exactly what you're saying, is creating value at the right price. So I think that's actually good. I think if you're talking about the problems to be solved, I think that's often where it starts, right? That you got somebody who's super smart and understands technology and sees a superficial problem. So, the supply chain or the logistics is inefficient and there's too much paper. Okay, let me create an end-to-end tool that can solve all those problems. I can see intuitively that makes sense, but I think there is a lack of understanding of the complexity of that and what are the problems you're trying to solve. So if you're asking about where I often see it going wrong, is people are trying to, either they don't understand, either they're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, or they're trying to solve a problem that's very, very complex and where they might not have a solution. And I think, to your point, that I still think that there is a long-term need to solve the end-to-end logistics supply chain, whether it's visibility or whether it's the flow of data or flow of money. There is certainly a tool or tools out there that are relevant. But it's very important to understand that right now, I don't think that you can create that tool. I think if you're saying within the next 2 years, I think it's tools that solve very specific problems, right? So how do you digitalize a very specific process? So it could be final mile delivery. You look at some of the unicorns in the US that I think have done the right thing. They focused on how do we do final mile delivery where we get full visibility to where the product is so we can make real-time changes on delivery modes and so on, or optimize a specific process. If you look at the digital freight forward, I think the ones that are most successful are the ones that try to focus on solving a relatively specific and clear product, and where technology is part of it, but there is also an element of understanding the industry and addressing the industry. So, the obvious one that's come up the last few months, I guess, is how do you deploy AI as a tool to solve issue, right? I think if you look at forwarding, 80% of our business is happening without a lot of problems. So it's a happy flow. And then you got 20% that is where you need to focus on your attention. But we don't spend our time 80-20 like that also. We spend more time on handling the happy flow. So any technology that can simplify the happy flow that just happens without interference and really focuses on solving the problems that exist. So I would say anything that's exception handling, process management of the problem part of the supply chain that enables people to come into the office and instead of checking the 200 files they have on a ship, they are told that there's 20 files that are not going according to plan. What do we do about that? And that could move into other places. It's in the warehouse. What are the 20 orders that needs to go out this morning? Rather than, okay, here's a flow of 5,000 different things that are happening. So I think exception handling and well-defined problems are the ones that will have the most traction in the next 2 years. I don't think that means you should not focus on solving the bigger problems. I think you just have to recognize that they're much harder and they'll take a lot longer and are very complex. So you're taking some bigger risks when you invest in that or you design products.
And I guess it's back to the, we were talking offline, that balance between what do we fix today and kind of what is the bigger picture in the future. But you got to move with both. It's like anything. It's like when people step into a new role, great, you present to whatever the boss of that role is, your vision for the next 3 years, but after 6 months, you'd better show that you've done something already that has added value to the company. Otherwise, it doesn't fly.
No, I absolutely agree. I think if you're talking about, the role of a leader, and the more senior you get is, of course, you have to look forward and anticipate and plan for what will happen next year. And if you're the chairman or the CEO, you're in some cases talking 3, 5, 10 years out. But that doesn't mean you can ignore the present, right? If you're looking at what happened with COVID, I think we all realized that you needed to fix a problem immediately. And perhaps COVID was hard to imagine, but we all knew that there was a risk out there that was called a pandemic, right? So perhaps we should have spent more time looking at the pandemic as a potential risk and thought through what that could look without having a specific plan. But we often end up focusing too much on what is right in front of us. And I think you asked earlier, and reflection, the difference between, I think, the CEO and the chairman is less busy handling the day-to-day. Most CEOs are really busy doing both, and they work very, very hard. As a chairman, I'm also working relatively hard, but I'm working more on trying to see what is 3, 5, 10 years out, whether it's technology or whether it's, for instance, the impact of climate change and what we need to do to address climate change. And then I think that's the luxury of being a non-exec chairman, is that you have time to spend on looking forward, whilst the CEO and the leadership team of a business are really busy ensuring that the day-to-day issues are solved, but also looking ahead.
On a recent discussion, we had the Professor Sheffy from MIT on the topic of, again, being practical, and fixing for what is. I actually asked him, so, what would you do if you were to start a business? He had started 5 businesses before, which he sold. And he told me, well, I know for sure that I wouldn't start in AI. His point is like the worst possible idea is to go and start an AI company, because you're fighting with the Googles and the Microsofts and whatnot. And plus it's overhyped. So, just go into an organization. His point was similar to yours. Go into an organization, work for about 1 year, or just observe what's happening if you can, and you'll find a million problems that you can practically address. In your case, you mentioned exceptions or whatever it is, a very consistent pain that they have now. No need to, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. No need to AI your way into a solution when actually, there's many ways to fix it. Thought that was a relevant add. Now, sticking to AI and then linking it to skills and talent, and how do we can we in the first place, and how do we prepare ourselves for the future of work, Thomas, and for staying relevant as employees, as leaders, as executives in this world in which increasingly it seems that AI will continue to do better and better. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think the interesting thing first about generative AI is it kind of came out of nowhere in some ways, right? 3-4 months ago. So if I'd asked you or anyone else that are involved in this business 5 or 10 years ago and said, how do you prepare yourselves for a future career, very broadly, not just within our business, you would probably have said, oh, you should be a lawyer, you should be an engineer, you should be whatever. And I think if you look at what is happening now, I think you could say that something like AI will have a dramatic impact on the legal profession, because a lot of work is spent on reviewing contracts, drafting contracts, and so on, that can be done better by AI. So what's the future of being a lawyer? I don't know. And if you ask me what's the future of working in supply chain, I'm not sure I can answer that. What I do think I can say is it's unlikely that what will make you successful today in the labor market is going to be successful in 20 years. So if you think you can predict the future, I would probably say, where is the world going to be in 20 years, and how do I set myself up for success? But I think it comes back, and we've talked about this before, Rado, that what does a successful career look like, and how do you build it? And for me, it's about, AI will do a lot of things smarter than I will ever be, and already is. So what's my unfair advantage? My unfair advantage is I can drink coffee with people, and I can have empathy and talk to them and try to understand their problems and render my advice from my career and so on. So I think if you think about building a career, I think it's building a career where you have experiences that are different, where you've gone through tough times, good times, you can connect with interesting people and so on. So I know it's a wishy-washy answer in as much as I'm not giving a specific role or technology or whatever, but I actually think that the idea of saying, how do I stay relevant, is by leveraging what is the most human things, which is human connections. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't learn math and trades and what AI is and so on. Absolutely. But you'll never be smarter in the future than an AI engine when it comes to understanding what's going on with a specific process or whatever. But I do think you can add value by having some skills that connect people going forward. So wishy-washy answer, but I think it's more about being open and learning about a lot of different things than rather being focused on trying to beat AI, because I consider that highly unlikely.
And I'll also steer the conversation, and now we're reaching the end. I'll steer the conversation also in terms of the future. I know that you are doing a lot of work regarding ocean conservation. I mean, you're an avid diver. I think there's quite a few projects that you're doing in that respect around conserving the planet, conserving the oceans. Maybe tell us a little bit, some plugs around the work that you do, and maybe we get some more volunteers for you from the listeners of the podcast.
Yeah, so we talked about getting older earlier, and again, I don't think of myself as old, but I think my career has changed from my early career where I was very focused on myself as how am I successful, and then I think it became about how do I make my team successful and enable others, and I enjoyed both processes. I think if you look at the last couple of years, I've started focusing on how can I help the planet being successful, if you want to call it that, and it's not like, there's some big moral, I'm a better person, I'm very religious, or it's not coming from this, but I actually think it's a very exciting intellectual challenge to say, I think we're facing an existential crisis for humanity and for the planet. So can I play a role in that? And the interesting thing for me is that I think it's not just a question of running around and picking up plastic on the beaches or save a shark here or there, because, that I'm very passionate about that. But if you think about we having to get to net zero by 2050 or whatever you want to focus on, this will present enormous financial opportunities. People say that net zero will probably be $100 to $200 trillion opportunity or cost. If you work in a business, whether you run a business, whether you're an employee, whether you have your own business, if you look at that and you think that's a transition that is equal to one or two other transitions in the history of mankind, so shouldn't there be some opportunities there? If you were the first guy to invent the steam machine or, the steam-driven saw or, the first car or whatever, the opportunities were endless. And my view is that you can still do a lot of good things in business at the same time doing, very well for the planet, right? So how do you do transition to electric vehicles? How do you do transition to hydrogen, installing solar cells, reducing plastic waste? And even in the short term, some of these things even improve your P&L because you're just taking waste out of your business. So I think that's kind of how we think about it. But if you think about what I do personally, I'm very passionate around this. I think it's exciting to work with other people who are passionate, whether that's in your corporate life or in your private life. People talk about retirement. It's like, oh, you're going to go play golf. And I'm like, who wants to play golf every day? First of all, I don't play golf, so that's not an option. But number two, I think that what makes me excited, and most people I know, is that you meet with people who are smart, intelligent, who inspires you, that you can learn from, whether it's then family or others. And I really enjoy that. And in this space, there is a lot of people who are super passionate and very, very smart and who are dedicating their life to solve these problems. And I truly enjoy working with them. And at the same time, then as a family office, we do investments in this space. And as I said, it's both an opportunity to have a positive impact on big problems such as plastic pollution of the oceans, or how do we change building materials in our supply chain, to going out and doing something really practical like stopping fishing or stopping plastic pollution or so on. So it really gives you a broad place to play, and I still think you can make a lot of money. If you look at plastic pollution, this is one of the things that a lot of companies are struggling with today, is that at some point they expect they will have to pay for that, whether it's through plastic penalties or plastic credits, whether it's because they can't use plastic anymore. So they're looking to say, well, how do we get access to that? And if you as an investor can present that to them in a way where we have a solution, you can make money in this space. So you can both do good and make money at the same time.
Well said. Final question, and you've already shared quite a few, but if you were to think, there's a bunch of people listening to this that are just graduating, what would be one or two pieces of advice that you would give them to best help them in their careers, in their future jobs, and so on?
So I have seen many different career paths, so I don't have the perfect one, but I can say what I would do if I had to do it again. I think the first 10 years of your career, from until you're 30, let's call it that, depending on when you start, but at least the first years of your career, just spend learning it. Don't have too much of a plan. Get out, get to understand how things work. Be willing to do some stuff that might be hard. So, go travel, live in countries that are different than what you're used to, which can be difficult, but get out and learn. And some of the learning is not obvious. It might not take you down the path that you think is relevant when you're 22, but I can tell you that whatever you learn and whatever you experience early will form your future career. And then I see perhaps the 30s, and I'm simplifying it in terms of years, but it's perhaps easier, that is the second part of career where you start narrowing in and saying, okay, this is what I'm really passionate about. This is what I'm really good at. This is what I want to make my place in my career. And then the rest of your career is hopefully benefiting from those years in terms of kind of building on top of that. But I think the first 10 years, I always worry when I hear people who have laid out the rest of their life, because my best experiences didn't come from planning. It came from going, oh, wow, I didn't realize that I needed to do this to learn something about people, about business, about culture or whatever. So, don't get too freaked out in the beginning that you don't have a plan or that you're not being successful. Sometimes failure and problems and struggles will make you a much better leader for the future. So don't encourage failure, but certainly when it will happen, and it will, embrace it.
Like the great philosopher Mike Tyson said, no, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So deal with it and get up.
And we will all get punched in the face. So it's not like
it's just a matter of time.
No, that won't happen to me, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thomas, thanks a lot for the time, for the sharing, for the many great examples. It's been a delight. And keep up the great work and inspiring, the new generation of leaders, as well as doing all the interesting projects that you're part of.
Thanks, Rado, and thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives in supply chain or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.